All right. Welcome to the Last Place on Earth podcast. My name is Jared Mazza. I'm here with special guest today, Dr Sue Chapman, independent candidate for the seat of Forrest. Dr Sue, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you.
That's good. Now, community independent candidates are often into transparency, so I thought it was important that we be totally transparent here. We've tried to do this once before, earlier in the week.
We did.
Down in Bunbury at your campaign office. We're now in Fremantle, Last Place on Earth HQ. Thank you for coming to join us, and thanks for doing this again.
Oh, look, that's absolutely fine. It's my pleasure. We had to come to Perth today. The only AEC office that I can lodge my nomination with is in Perth. So we were coming up to Perth anyway.
Right, that's interesting. So everyone from across the state has to get their paperwork to...
I'm not sure, but when we made inquiries, we had to come to Perth.
Yeah, right. And you had to get 100 signatures or something to...
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of paperwork that you have to fill in that says, you know, I am X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, E, all of those different things.
You don't have two passports.
I don't have two passports and I don't have a parent who has, you know, some weird citizenship that I don't know about. And then also at least 100 signatures. So I think we ended up submitting about 170.
Right.
Just so we make sure that there's absolutely no question.
And you're running for the seat of Forrest. Where is the seat of Forrest, firstly, for our listeners who may not know?
Yeah, so it's in the southwest, and the northern part of it is from Yarloop, and then it incorporates all of the coastal strip down through the outskirts of, well, Harvey, then Bunbury, and then inland a little bit to Boyana, and then down through Bustleton, Margaret River, all the way down to Augusta and Scott River on the eastern.
So it's a pretty large area of space.
It's massive.
Yeah. And I grew up down in Bunbury, so that is kind of the area that I grew up in. But as well as being a big space geographically, it's fairly diverse, right, in terms of communities and the kind of people who are there.
Yeah, look, I think that's what a lot of people feel, but there's been huge demographic changes in the southwest, particularly over the last 5 years. And, you know, travelling around and meeting people in all different parts of the electorate now, it's not nearly as kind of pocketed as you might expect. And, you know, there's lots of young professionals who've moved into more rural areas because that's where they can afford to buy a house. And then there's a big population of much more urban areas in Bunbury now, certainly Bustleton, Coaramup, you know, much more urban population.
Yeah. So let's set the scene politically a little bit as well. Nola Marino is the sitting MP. She's about to retire. She's been in that position for quite some time.
17 years.
17 years, yeah. And the Liberal Party have held the seat for...
Only 52 years.
Only 52 years, all right.
Yeah.
Has it ever been held by an independent before, do you know?
No. So there was a 3-year period of time where it was held by Labor.
Yeah.
But this is the first time an independent has run within the last 50 years.
Yeah. And what is it?
No, sorry. There was an independent who ran in 2012.
Right.
Yeah.
What is it that makes you think that it's ripe for an independent candidate?
Yeah, there's a number of factors which have happened. So at the last election, there was a massive swing against the incumbent. And so that actually meant that at the end of the day, the AEC now says that we're a marginal seat with only a 4.2% margin. The member is retiring, and so they're putting up a new candidate for the Liberal Party, and all the other candidates are new as well. So it's a completely fresh start, if you like.
And so you're a community independent candidate. As I understand it, generally there's a kind of process that's gone through with those candidates.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Where did this all begin in terms of Forrest?
Yeah, so what happened was, even before the 2022 election, a group of people were starting to think about whether a community independent might be a possibility, obviously looking at the strength of what had happened in Indi over an extended period of time. And then at the last election, with the success of a significant number of community independents and the big swing in our seat and the expectation that the member would retire, a group of people pulled together and created Voices for Forrest. And I became part of that group, and we spent 15 months doing community consultation, where we went around doing kitchen table conversations, getting surveys, going to markets and doing online surveys. And so out of that, we kind of very much followed the Indi model, which was, doing that community consultation, asking people what they loved about where they lived, what they felt was a problem about where they lived, and whether they felt that they were well represented. And at the end of that, we had polled right across the electorate, and more than 500 people had contributed. And there was an over 85% rate of people saying they didn't feel well represented. And so at that point, the committee that had formed for Voices for Forest decided that they were going to look for a candidate. And so I stepped back from the process, because at that time I was a surgeon and I was perfectly happy being a surgeon. But I knew that I was kind of super interested now in this community independent idea. And when they said that they wanted to run a candidate, I said, well, look, I need to be completely separate from that process. And then they put out an expressions of interest, and it took a lot for me to kind of decide to throw my hat in the ring. And then once I had decided I was going to, I was really grateful that I was the one who got the nomination.
Yeah. So what was that like when they came to you and asked you? What was your thought process there? Because you're a practicing surgeon.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was this real dilemma, because I had become so invested in what was going on with Voices for Forest, and I found it fascinating to see how people really loved being asked to be part of that process. And it was such a positive thing. So part of me was torn by wanting to just support that process, and then also thinking to myself, I feel really passionate about a lot of these things. And I had been in a situation where I had previously been involved in an environmental action, and I felt that I was reasonably qualified to put my hand up to do it. And then it was a lot of discussion with myself and with my family, is this really something that I wanted to do? And at the end of the day, I said, I'll really regret it if I don't try. I really wanted to try and have a go and see how it goes.
Yeah. And so what's happened with your medical practice?
Yeah, so I decided I would retire from my medical practice. So I closed my medical practice December 31, and pretty much have been doing this full time since January 6th.
So what are the issues that you think are kind of top of the mind for these voters in Forrest who maybe don't feel like they're being properly represented?
Yeah. Out of that community consultation, we came up with regional housing. I mean, it's absolutely massive in the Southwest. Really big issue that, is creating a lot of problems with a lot of homeless people, a lot of people at risk of being homeless. And also economically, it's causing a problem because industry and business can't get workers because they can't find houses. So housing's a huge issue. Because of my background in health, I have some pretty strong opinions about regional health. And a lot of people feel that regional health is really not looked after particularly well. And a lot of the money comes to metro areas. The environment, we have a beautiful part of the world, and a lot of people want to come and visit our part of the world because it is so spectacularly beautiful. We're a biodiversity hotspot. And yet, in the process of wanting to house people and wanting to build structures and wanting to do things, we are tearing down a lot of really critical, beautiful woodlands and areas that are for national, matters of national environmental significance. So for me, going into this space, hoping to make some impact on our environmental laws is a really big part of this.
And you mentioned earlier, environmental action. From what I understand, you were involved in a campaign around the Bunbury Outer Ring Road to protect some forest.
So I became involved with a group that were passionately against the position of the southern section. So we said that the road, yes, Bunbury absolutely needed an outer ring road. There was no doubt about that. The congestion within the city was becoming quite difficult. But the route for the southern section was the least sustainable, the most impactful on the environment, and the most impactful on the local community. And there were alternatives that could have been used, and unfortunately they weren't. And so we lost 78 hectares of Banksia woodland.
And it was beautiful forest. I remember going down there and seeing the kind of protest camp that was set up, and
it was terrible. And, we were in there, we were documenting the trees. There were trees in there that were more than 400 years old. There were spectacular examples of particular trees. And there was, some suggestion that there was Indigenous heritage in there as well.
Yeah.
And yet we could not convince anyone to listen to us. And we could not, our local member and the federal member basically refused to meet with us. And that was also part of my kind of drive to get into this space, because I said, that's not representation.
Yeah.
You might disagree with me and you might not think that I have something of benefit to say, but really you should at least listen.
Yeah. So was that campaign pivotal for you personally?
Yeah, very much so. Because it was absolutely apparent by the end of that campaign that unless you're inside the building sitting at the table, they just keep shutting the door in your face. And the decisions are only ever made inside the building at the table. So unless you have a seat at that table, it's really hard to make a difference.
I remember going down to cover the protest down there around the Outer Ring Road, and my car got bogged. So there's something about my machinery in the southwest that is there's some kind of cursed relationship going on there. Given the technical problems we've had today, but I digress. We push on. Okay, so in the paper, maybe last weekend, I think, or about a week ago, I read an article that said that you were having mysterious, shady donors. I think there was donations as large as $100,000 that it was saying were being disclosed as anonymous on your website. So you disclose all your donations on your website, which you don't have to do, right? That's not a requirement.
Yeah, so I made a decision at the beginning of this campaign that I would have a donor wall on my website. And what that does is it allows people in reasonably real time, it's not perfect, but reasonably real time, to look and see who's donating to my campaign. Now, we do offer people the option of donating anonymously, because in fact some people might be members of another political party. They might have a government job, which means they can't openly support me. And because it's not a legal requirement, I think that it's perfectly acceptable to say to people, tick if you would like to remain anonymous, but we encourage every person to be open.
Yeah. So from what I understand, there are disclosure rules that relate to large donations, I think above $16,000.
Yeah.
But those aren't disclosed in real time.
No. So what happens with the actual disclosures that have to be made to the AEC? So once the election's done and dusted, all of that paperwork has to be collated by the campaign. And anybody who's donated over a certain threshold, you have to disclose that to the AEC.
Yeah.
But that then won't be officially published for 15 months.
So not so useful if I want to use that information to
help
decide who I'm
guide.
going to vote for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to come back to your anonymous donation story.
Yeah, yes.
So unfortunately, one of the glitches that we had when we set up our donor wall was that if somebody clicked they wanted to be anonymous and they didn't want to be anonymous, the system wouldn't allow us to take that out.
Right, you couldn't go back. Right.
So every day, one of our staff members would have to go in and manually unclick.
So who was this big mysterious donor then? Who was the...
So the big reveal that we had to make was that it was me.
It was you.
And you know, I'm perfectly happy to have my donations made public. You know, I'm supporting my own campaign because I think this is a really positive change for Forrest. But it was just unfortunate that in between speaking to the journalist on the Friday, where we were questioned about two $10,000 donations, our system glitched.
Yeah.
My donations suddenly were allocated to be anonymous.
Right.
And unfortunately, the journalist didn't come back to us and ask any further questions and published in the West Australian.
So if the West had have picked up the phone to you and said, hey, we've just seen there are these other big donations, what's going on? I presume you would have told them.
It would have been a very simple answer that, you know, this is the problem. All of those donations are related to, you know, Sue Chapman.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately the story may not have been quite so sensational.
There wouldn't have been much of a story, would there? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's interesting. I saw that this week another community independent, Kate Chaney from Curtin, she had some fairly critical words for the West in particular and for the kind of establishment media about how they've covered her campaign. What do you make of the way that the mainstream media, and in WA that really does mean 7 West, there's not many other options. What do you make of the way that they've covered your campaign but also just community independence more broadly?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think to be absolutely fair, you know, the local press in the Southwest has been incredibly supportive and very generous and, you know, has not resorted to any type of dirty tactics or any problem at all. It's been, you know, I'm really grateful to my local media. From the West Australian point of view, you know, obviously it's disappointing when a journalist takes that approach, and I don't read the West Australian, so I can't comment on any of their coverage of Kate's campaign, but I know that she has previously been very concerned about the types of coverage that she's had.
So, I mean, talking about, you know, Kate Chaney and other community independents, you're often grouped together. You're sometimes called teals. I've noticed in coverage of you that you're called a teal. Are you okay with that label?
I'm going to say that, you know, it's a frustrating label because it's often used in the media as a pejorative term, and it's often used to imply that in fact we are all part of the same organisation and that there's mysterious donors in the background who are somehow, you know, artificially creating a party, when in fact it completely ignores all of the work that goes into creating a community independent campaign. Now, if you look at who the teals are actually, you know, when the papers talk about teals or the press talks about teals, it's particularly the 6 women who were successful at the last election, who all took prized Liberal seats and who were all incredibly intelligent, articulate, professional women. Somehow Zali Steggall, who was, she was elected in 2019 before the term teal even became apparent, somehow she gets lobbied into that as well.
Yeah.
But people like Helen Haynes and David Pocock are not.
Yeah, yeah.
So for me, it's where the media is trying to pigeonhole you. and say, oh, and it's primarily when you're in a seat that Liberal would really like to have.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I don't identify, for me, I'm a community independent that has come from this grassroots organisation, from an extensive period of consultation, and I'm in a regional area. So it's a completely different dynamic from the group of women who were successful at the last election.
Yeah. I mean, there are also, I guess, some things that a lot of those candidates have in common. One of them being, from what I understand, all of those candidates you mentioned have received donations from Climate 200. So when people say, oh, this is just a kind of political party in disguise, Simon Holmes à Court is bankrolling this for his own interests, he's got investment in renewables, et cetera, there's an agenda here. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so if I'm in a community meeting and somebody asks me that question, my answer is to ask the crowd, how many of you here have contributed to a GoFundMe? And usually about 60% of people in the room will put their hand up. And I explain that Climate 200 is a GoFundMe that has had over 40,000 individual donors from all around Australia, and a third of those donors have come from regional electorates.
Yeah.
And so whilst Simon Holmes à Court was the founder of Climate 200 and he continues to be a convener, he's no longer associated with how the money gets distributed.
Yeah.
And for a candidate, there's a two-way street that happens, because you apply for funding and then you decide if you're going to take it.
Yeah.
But also, it's a bit of an endorsement of your campaign, because they actually will only fund campaigns that they think have a chance of success.
Yeah.
And so, for me, I don't have a problem with aligning with the principles of action on climate change, integrity in politics and advancement of women.
Yeah.
And when I'm in my electorate, there's a lot of people who say to me, have you had money from Climate 200? And I kind of look at them and a bit nervously say, yes. And they go, oh, thank God I donated to them. I'm so glad it's coming back to you.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it does strike me that just the narrative around Climate 200 is kind of ridiculous, and I think especially so when you consider how the major parties work and how money in politics works a bit more generally. So, firstly, like coming back to the disclosure of the donations things, the major parties aren't doing what you're doing and putting their donations on their websites.
No. So the funny thing about that is, when I was thinking, how much is it going to cost me to run this campaign? I went onto the AEC website and I looked how much the Liberal Party had spent in Forrest at the last election. And have a guess how much they spent.
Oh, I mean, I guess be millions of dollars, right?
So in fact, the official disclosure was $0.
Right, okay.
And so I thought, brilliant, this is going to be a cheap exercise, fantastic. But in fact, what that means is that we have no idea.
So does that mean that they're using party resources to campaign in the seat rather than the candidate using their resources? Right.
If they have a completely safe seat and they don't want to put any money into that seat, they'll give them a bare amount of funding.
Yeah.
But say, for example, Curtin at the moment, they're throwing a lot of money into Curtin.
Yeah.
And it makes it really hard for punters to know, how much money did come into Forrest at the last election? Where did that money come from? Because it all is, in fact, just disclosed as Liberal Party money.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing that kind of blows my mind about elections in general is that really the big winners are Meta, Google, and the billboard companies, because there's just so much money that gets poured into political campaigning. And I guess that's why it seems to me a bit distorted the narrative, because the major parties have kind of created this situation where there's such a high barrier to entry, and then the established media turns around and says, well, look at these, well-funded teal independents. But it's like, well, what do you can't run a political campaign with no money. It's just the reality that we're in.
Yeah, I think there's figures that get put around that, for all of the community independents, the funding that might come from a group like Climate 200 might be 25 million. But the budget for the two majors is 550 million. So
it's mind-blowing. I mean, even when you think about the housing issues, the cost of living issues, it's like, do we really need to be spending that much money on this?
Yeah, and I think it's, for me, it is important to have that disclosure. It means I've copped a lot of heat, because I am being open and transparent, I cop a lot of heat. But that's okay, because if I can start to move a needle and start to say, well, if I can do this as an independent with pretty much not many staff and not much resources, why can't the majors do it? Why can't we know ahead of time how much the sports bets of this world, the Santos, the big Gina Reinhardts of this world, why can't we know how much they're donating?
Yeah. Does it take a personal toll? Do you kind of see yourself in the paper and think, there's all these implications about me and whatnot? Is that something that must be a new kind of thing for you to have to deal with, right?
It is new, but it's completely expected.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate in that I had sat down about 2 weeks ago and thought, okay, things are starting to get real. What's likely to happen now? And so you can pretty much guarantee that there'll start to be Facebook ads and YouTube ads and television ads and newspaper articles that perhaps shine you in a not very pleasant light. And you know what was beautiful about Monday? We had a volunteer meeting online and we had more than 80 people come into that online meeting. And all day I was getting messages of support from people. And in fact, it turned what could have been a horrible day into an absolutely beautiful day where people were genuinely coming out in support of the campaign saying, we see through this, we see through these attacks, we believe in you, Sue, keep going.
And I suppose the other side of it is as well that they're not going to bother if they're not worried, that you must be bothering them to some degree.
I think I'm rattling a few chains.
And we see that with Kate Chaney at the moment. Like the pamphlet, I don't know if you've seen the pamphlets that they're distributing in the letterboxes in Curtin, but they're pretty brutal. So I guess, as you are threatening...
Yeah, I took great pride in the fact that Peter Dutton got flown into Bustleton Airport yesterday to make an announcement.
Bustle yesterday,
Because previously we would have never had anybody come to Forrest. So even if it's just that I'm pushing the needle, pushing the dial, making the other parties work harder, making everybody in the electorate work harder, then surely that's a better outcome for our electorate.
And there's a bit of a paradox there. I think that the safe seats, the seats that they've held for a long time, end up becoming neglected because, they put the money into the marginal seats, they put the attention into the marginal seats. And so these poor voters who might have voted Liberal all their life because that's just, what they do and what they're used to, aren't really getting much in response for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, we actually did a media statement this week about health because we had the Prime Minister, coming into WA announcing a big announcement in a very marginal seat about a hospital upgrade. Did the same thing in Adelaide, one of the most marginal seats. What a surprise, all of a sudden a massive big hospital and medical education upgrade. And so, for me, switching up that narrative in what is now, technically a marginal seat, it is actually that people are having to pay attention to Forrest and say, well, come on, what have we been getting for the last 52 years? What's on the table for us going forward?
There's another line I want to put to you. I've heard Albo say this one now, and I think I heard Josh Wilson, the local MP here, say it. He said, well, what are you going to do if you've got a parliament full of independents? No one's going to be able to form government. They're not going to be able to get anything done, basically offering a defence of the major parties. How do you respond to that line of argument?
And it's a common thing that, both sides put forward, because what the community independents do is threaten their power base, big time. And they like to believe that they'll be able to sweep in with a majority and, you know, follow their platform for a period of time, no questions asked, and be able to pander to whoever they want to pander in the background, and Australia just has to put up with it. The last time we actually had a hung parliament or a minority government was the most effective time at passage of legislation. And the great thing about having a broad crossbench is that what's been shown in the last parliament is it improves the discourse within parliament, it improves the quality of question time, it improves the quality of debate, and it also improves the legislation because of the number of amendments that the crossbenchers put on. So, you know, I think it's really, again, one of those attack or shock or fear tactics to try to make people scared. But the real people who are scared are the power mongers of the Labor and Liberal Party, because they don't want to lose that control, and they now sense that their control is rapidly slipping as people are sick and tired of the two major parties.
So say you're elected and there's no clear majority in the parliament. Are you going to be talking to both sides to, you know, see who might be able to form government? What's your thinking about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that I'm going to be absolutely honest here and say that if I'm elected, or when I'm elected, it is going to be a matter of seeing what gets put on the table.
Yeah.
And specifically what gets put on the table about pretty major issues like what's going to happen with environmental reform, why aren't we getting any movement on gambling reform, what's going to happen in Forrest for the next 3 years, tax reform, all of these big ticket items that Australians are really wanting the government to get their teeth into. And so it's really about sitting there saying, okay, well, who's bringing what to the table? What do I perceive is going to be the best outcome on the evidence that's put in front of me at that time? And I would essentially only be guaranteeing them supply and confidence, but reserving my right to review each bill on its merits.
Let's talk a little bit about energy, because I think that in Southwest, in Forrest, energy is a really interesting issue. I feel like in some ways it's a bit of a microcosm for the energy debate in Australia and questions around the energy transition. So, you know, there was there still is coal-fired power in Collie, which is being closed down, and there's a plan to transition away from that. And then, from what I understand, it's been going on some time. There's some renewable projects there. There's also, you know, been a focus on tourism and arts and stuff in that local community. Then recently, last year, Peter Dutton said he would like to put a nuclear reactor there at the site of the coal-fired power station. What do you make of that plan?
Yeah, look, I mean, it was a fascinating announcement. And I'm going to say that for many people, it was a major surprise. You know, for the people of Collie, they have been part of a transition project for at least the last 10 years. And they can see the benefits in their town of government investment, that's particularly state government investment, in renewable energy projects and in battery banks and in tourism and development of the town and transitioning workers once the coal-fired stations are going to be stopped. When you look at the detail of the nuclear policy, well, really, it's a blank page. There is no detail.
Yeah, truly.
And so, you know, if you're wanting to be evidence-based and you're wanting to make the best decision for your community, it's impossible to assess that proposal. But when people ask me about do I support it or not, I say, well, look, there's very significant legislative barriers to that particular site. We don't currently in Australia have any legislation towards where we put a nuclear waste repository. And there are states like South Australia that have significant legislation against that. In Collie, water is a major issue, and nuclear reactors are they have a major requirement for water. And the Southwest is, in a warming, drying climate. Where are we going to get the water to do that? I think we need to have sensible discussions about energy policy, not just let's just throw an idea out there with nothing to back it up. And then, I think the other thing about it, which was really bothersome, was this expectation that it would reduce energy prices. And now we've been told in no uncertain terms that reduction in energy prices is, off in Never Never Land. And the potential for cost blowouts is massive. So, I think that having a discussion about nuclear, sure, bring it to the table, but bring it to the table in a logical, sensible, well set out policy, and let's pick that apart on the evidence.
So how do you see the transition to renewables proceeding in the Southwest? From what I understand, there are some pretty big projects. I mean, there's also been some controversy, and I'm thinking especially of the offshore wind zone, the federal government's plan for that, and there was a lot of controversy over that in the community based on various grounds.
Still is.
And still is, I'm sure there still is, I mean, are you having a lot of conversations about the wind farm? Is that the offshore wind farm?
It's brought up quite often. And, my response again is to say for any of these major renewable projects, they need to be positioned in the right place with the right environmental impact and the right community engagement and the right outcomes for that community. Now, at the present, again, we don't have a single, a single position statement, proposal. There is nothing to review. We think that maybe there are 4 companies that might be applying for feasibility licenses, but we don't know.
Yeah, and one company withdrew recently, right?
3 have withdrawn recently. And, the economics of offshore wind is pretty tricky. And particularly in WA, where we have a large landmass, they are building an equivalent size onshore wind farm just north of Collie. So again, it's a bit like the nuclear policy. You can talk about it till the cows come home, but until you actually see something put in front of you that says this is what it is, and this is what it means for the community, and this is what it means for the environment, and these are the pros and these are the cons, well, you can't make a valid evidence-based decision.
Yeah. I mean, I think what the government says and what supporters of offshore wind say is that will actually, just because of the volume of energy that we need, offshore wind is a good way to get, that large amount of energy. So I guess, are you open to it being part of the mix?
Let's talk then about how I see energy.
Sure, yeah.
And it's a little bit more for me about looking at it's domestic versus industrial.
Yeah.
So if you have domestic energy, then we should be looking to electrify everything. We should be promoting democratisation of housing and properties so that each person has a rebate for solar on their roof and a battery if they would like. And then those people can be responsible for their own energy. And yes, you have to work out how that works for renters and people who don't own their own properties and in high-rise buildings and all of those things. But the private energy market should be a reasonably easy fix.
Big corporations aren't going to like it though, because there's less for them to make money from.
But that's the reality. That would be a reasonable solution. Instead of offering people a one-off energy rebate, why aren't we looking more long-term and saying this is actually a way that we can smooth out our grid? If you buy an electric vehicle, why can't you plug that electric vehicle back into your house? That's the biggest battery you will ever buy. And yet our government laws at the present time don't require that of our electric vehicle manufacturers. So, for me, I think the domestic side of things is relatively easy. there's been quite a lot of work done in the manufacturing industry around looking at the capacity to electrify manufacturing. And there's no doubt that a lot of the middle tier of manufacturing could be electrified relatively easily. And so again, we should be promoting that as a solution for that middle tier. And then in the southwest, we have a couple of really big energy users, and they are the big industrial complexes. And it always makes me laugh when the government talks about, look at this great big battery we've built. It will actually manage this population for 4 hours. And then you say, well, how long will it power industry? 4 minutes maybe. You know, these people are using enormous amounts of energy, and they are producing products that the world and we need. And so we have to look at how we reasonably power them. And unfortunately, for a period of time as a transition, I think the only way we're going to do that is to have gas. And we need to be therefore promoting the use of our own gas back into a system that allows those big manufacturers to have energy reliability at a reasonable price. As we then set an end date and continue to work out how we're going to power them in the long term.
I think it's interesting because I think as well as, there's domestic residential energy, then there's domestic industrial energy, and then there's the great big volume of gas that's being exported overseas, which dwarfs both of them. So, I guess what I'd like to see is, as you say, there's a transition that has to be made. We can't just make the switch overnight. So let's use what we've got to do it responsibly. And also let's support those other industries which are going to fill that gap once gas comes offline.
Many of the big industrial users, like the miners up north, are already recognising that electrification is the way to go. So, I think what we have to now do is take a very responsible gas policy. Instead of just allowing companies to just ship it overseas and sell it and, we then pay a premium, it actually should be that is Australian gas. And therefore, Australia will need that gas. And luckily in Western Australia, we do have a gas reserve and we do have a gas reserve policy. And it was interesting to me that it was Peter Dutton who was the one who raised an East Coast gas reserve and took on the ire of the gas companies, because that was very unexpected.
It is, but I guess the thing, with his plan, it's a two-part plan. It's reserve some, but then export way more, which I'm not sure those two things quite match up in reality. But look, I was glad that one of the major parties was finally kind of just saying, this is a problem.
I think that's right. And I think, again, having those discussions where we say, maybe as a country, we need to look sensibly about our resources. And, we have wasted massive opportunity in the last 10 to 20 years by allowing big companies to just export our resources with minimal return coming back into Australia. And, I think realistically people are now recognising that that's a big issue and that we've lost the potential for an enormous amount of wealth that could have been coming into this country. And so, again, that is likely to be something that will be brought to the table. I'm not quite sure who by, but it's certainly being discussed by a lot of people going forward from this election, that, looking at how we tax companies that make money in this country. If you're a multinational and you make money in this country, really you should pay tax in this country. And it should be as simple as that.
So how are you going about connecting with voters on some of these things? As we discussed, it's a big area space, it's a lot of people to see and places to go. What's the campaign look like? Where are you kind of prioritising the energy?
Yeah, it's a mixture of things. I've been doing this since January 6th. So it kind of started out at the beginning with a lot of meetings with councils and shire presidents and CEOs and mayors, trying to get their sense of what their patch was most worried about. So there's 6 local government areas in the seat of Forrest. So I went round and visited all of those, and then I went round and visited quite a number of the big industrial complexes as well, and spoke to the people who are running major businesses in the southwest. and had a chat with them about, where are their issues and what are their problems, and spoke with quite a few farmers as well about what are their issues, what are their problems. And then we've been doing picnic in the park, we've been doing politics in the pub, we've been doing town hall meetings, we've been doing one-on-one meetings when people ring up and say, I've got this particular issue that I want to talk to you about. Very lucky in the beginning that I had a group of wonderful supporters who were willing to open up their houses and invite anywhere from 10 to 80 guests, and then I could go and meet all of those people. And I describe it as my mycelium network. Underneath the surface, all these people who I meet, who then go out and meet other people, who then go out and meet other people, and gradually the network of infiltration has been across the electorate. A lot of time in the car, a lot of time,
In the electric car, I believe.
So I have an electric vehicle because we actually ended up, there's no billboards in the southwest, or hardly any billboards.
Oh, how nice. That's lovely.
Well, so what we've done is we've actually had 18 cars wrapped.
Oh, right.
So we have 18 mobile billboards.
Yeah.
And we have a ute.
Is this just people going about their everyday business?
Yeah, so it's just volunteers put up their hand.
Yeah.
And we had... we've had 17 people put up their hand, and I said, well, look, I should probably drive a branded vehicle. And I have a ute, which I also drive at times, and tell me, or trust me, on the campaign, having a ute is really a wonderful thing because you have your entire, portable office in the back with your core flutes and your hammers and your stakes and all of those things. Yeah. And when we go off and do picnics, it all gets piled into my ute. Yeah. So most of the time I'm driving the ute. Yeah. Then days like today when I come up to Perth, I'm in my electric car.
Right. Two ends of a spectrum, perhaps.
Yeah. By preference, it's certainly in my electric vehicle, but a bit more practical to have the ute.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Sue Chapman, thanks so much for joining us at The Last Place on Earth. Thanks so much for progressing through all the technological challenges. We're down to one microphone, but we've made it through to the end. So I appreciate your patience. I just want to say as well for our listeners, Last Place on Earth Productions is doing a daily election trail podcast with the independent candidate for Fremantle, Kate Hewlett. That's called A Piece of Kate. So you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. But we're also going to be bringing our own election coverage, talking to various candidates. If there's anyone who you think we should chat to, get in touch, send us a message, send us an email, and we can reach out. www.lastplaceonearth.com.au. Thanks again, Sue. And
it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
No worries. All the best with your campaign.
Thanks so much.